For 20 years, the man everyone called John Smith had been the perfect neighbor. He volunteered at the VA hospital, coached Little League baseball, and helped elderly residents with their groceries. Nobody questioned why he couldn't remember his real name or anything about his military service before 2003. Then last Tuesday, a war crimes investigator knocked on his door with a photograph that made John's blood run cold. Because the man in that picture wasn't John Smith, and he wasn't a hero. The story began in 2003, when medical personnel at Ramstein Air Base in Germany found an unconscious American soldier with severe head trauma and no identification. The man had been discovered by coalition forces in a bombed-out building in Baghdad, barely alive and suffering from injuries that should have killed him. His uniform bore no name tags, dog tags, or unit insignia that could identify him or explain how he had ended up alone in enemy territory. Which city in the world are you watching this video from today? Please subscribe and support us for more stories. The neurological damage was extensive. Doctors determined that massive head trauma had caused retrograde amnesia so severe that the patient had lost all memory of his identity, his military service, and everything about his life before the injury. Brain scans revealed significant damage to areas responsible for long-term memory formation and retrieval, making recovery of his past memories unlikely if not impossible. Military investigators conducted an exhaustive search to identify the unknown soldier, but their efforts were complicated by the chaos of ongoing combat operations and incomplete record-keeping in the war zone. Personnel rosters had been disrupted by frequent unit rotations, communication difficulties, and the destruction of administrative facilities during intense fighting. The unknown soldier's physical appearance suggested he was in his mid-30s, approximately 6 feet tall, with brown hair and distinctive scars that indicated previous combat experience. His muscle memory suggested advanced military training, and he demonstrated familiarity with weapons and tactical procedures that indicated special operations background. But none of these clues led to a definitive identification. Medical personnel at Ramstein had given him the temporary name John Smith, while continuing their attempts to determine his true identity. The name was chosen arbitrarily from common American surnames, intended as a placeholder until his real identity could be established through medical records, dental comparisons, or DNA analysis. But the identification process was complicated by the fact that John Smith's injuries suggested he had been involved in classified operations that might not appear in standard military records. His tactical knowledge and physical conditioning indicated special operations training that would typically be documented in highly classified files not readily available to medical personnel. The investigation into John Smith's identity had eventually been classified and transferred to intelligence agencies that specialized in sensitive personnel matters. Military medical staff were instructed to treat him as a standard amnesia case, while intelligence specialists continued their efforts to determine who he was and how he had been injured. John Smith's recovery had been remarkable by medical standards. Despite the severity of his brain trauma, he had regained basic cognitive functions, motor skills, and the ability to form new memories. His personality appeared intact, though obviously influenced by the absence of any personal history or established identity. What struck medical personnel most was John Smith's character. Despite having no memory of his past, he demonstrated exceptional kindness, empathy, and willingness to help others. He assisted medical staff with other patients, showed genuine concern for wounded soldiers, and displayed moral values that suggested a fundamentally decent person. The contrast between John Smith's obvious military expertise and his gentle, helpful personality had puzzled psychologists who worked with him during his recovery. Typically, soldiers with special operations backgrounds developed harder, more cynical personalities, but John Smith seemed almost innocent despite his evident combat experience. After 18 months of medical treatment and unsuccessful identification efforts, John Smith had been medically retired from military service with full disability benefits. His case had been documented as an unknown soldier whose identity remained classified pending ongoing investigation, but for practical purposes, he was free to begin a new life with a new identity. The Veterans Administration had provided John Smith with comprehensive support services, including housing assistance, vocational rehabilitation, and psychological counseling to help him adjust to civilian life without the anchor of personal history that most veterans relied upon during their transition. John Smith had chosen to settle in Cedar Falls, Iowa, a small Midwestern town that offered the kind of quiet, supportive community environment that VA counselors thought would be beneficial for someone rebuilding their life from scratch. The town's proximity to a regional VA medical center ensured continued access to specialized care for his ongoing neurological issues. The community had welcomed John Smith with the kind of small-town warmth that made his adjustment easier than it might have been in a larger, more anonymous city. Local residents understood he was a disabled veteran who had sacrificed his memory in service to his country, and they treated him with respect and genuine affection. John Smith had thrown himself into community service with an enthusiasm that impressed everyone who met him. He volunteered at the local VA hospital, helping other veterans navigate the complex bureaucracy of disability claims and medical appointments. His patience with confused or frustrated veterans was legendary among hospital staff. His work coaching Little League Baseball had been particularly meaningful to both John Smith and the community. Despite having no memory of his own childhood or whether he had ever played baseball, he demonstrated an intuitive understanding of the game and exceptional ability to connect with young players. Parents appreciated John Smith's approach to coaching, which emphasized teamwork, sportsmanship, and personal improvement over winning at all costs. Children responded to his genuine interest in their development, both as athletes and as people. Several parents had commented that John Smith seemed to understand their children better than coaches who had worked with youth sports for years. John Smith's relationship with elderly residents had begun accidentally when he noticed an elderly neighbor struggling with heavy grocery bags. His offer to help had led to regular assistance with shopping, yard work, and minor home repairs for several seniors who had difficulty managing these tasks independently. The elderly residents had adopted John Smith as an unofficial grandson, inviting him to family gatherings and treating him with the kind of affection typically reserved for close relatives. His willingness to listen to their stories and his genuine interest in their experiences had made him a beloved figure in their lives. John Smith's integration into the Cedar Falls community had been so complete that most residents forgot he was anything other than a local man who had always lived among them. His amnesia had become simply another personal characteristic, like a limp or a distinctive laugh, that made him unique but didn't define his relationships with others. The VA had continued monitoring John Smith's condition through regular medical checkups and psychological evaluations, but his adjustment had been so successful that these appointments had become routine formalities. His case had been cited in medical literature as an example of how severe amnesia patients could successfully rebuild their lives with appropriate support. 20 years of this quiet, productive life had established John Smith as one of Cedar Falls' most respected residents. Local newspaper articles about community service invariably mentioned his contributions, and he had received several awards from veterans organizations and civic groups. But John Smith's peaceful existence had been built on a foundation that was about to crumble. The investigation that would destroy his carefully constructed life had begun thousands of miles away, in the offices of the International Criminal Tribunal, where war crimes investigators were reviewing newly discovered evidence from conflicts in the night. Dr. Sarah Martinez was a forensic anthropologist who specialized in identifying victims of war crimes and mass atrocities. Her work involved analyzing physical evidence, witness testimony, and photographic documentation to build cases against individuals responsible for genocide, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. Dr. Martinez had been assigned to investigate mass graves discovered in Bosnia-Herzegovina, where construction workers had uncovered the remains of approximately 200 civilians who had been executed during ethnic cleansing operations. And the discovery had prompted renewed efforts to identify both victims and perpetrators of what appeared to be a previously unknown massacre. Forensic analysis of the mass grave had revealed that the victims had been executed in a systematic manner that suggested military organization and training. The positioning of bodies, patterns of gunshot wounds, and evidence of restraints indicated that the killings had been carried out by disciplined personnel following established procedures. Witness interviews conducted by Dr. Martinez's team had identified several survivors who had managed to escape during the massacre. These witnesses provided detailed descriptions of the perpetrators, including physical characteristics, uniforms, and specific individuals who had commanded the operation. One witness, an elderly woman named Mirza Petrovich, had provided particularly detailed testimony about the commander who had ordered the executions. She described him as a tall man with brown hair who spoke English with an American accent and wore what appeared to be modified American military equipment. Mrs. Petrovich's description had been significant because it suggested that American personnel might have been involved in war crimes during the Bosnian conflict. This possibility had prompted Dr. Martinez to request access to classified American military records and personnel files from the period. The investigation had been complicated by the fact that American special operations in Bosnia during the 1990s had been highly classified and poorly documented. Many operations had been conducted by units that officially didn't exist, using personnel whose identities were protected by multiple layers of security classification. Dr. Martinez had eventually obtained access to a collection of photographs and video footage that had been classified for over 20 years. The material had been captured by intelligence operatives who were documenting war crimes for future prosecution, but the evidence had been sealed for national security reasons. Review of the photographic evidence had revealed images that corroborated witness testimony about American involvement in atrocities during the Bosnian conflict. One series of photographs showed American personnel in civilian clothes directing local militia forces during what appeared to be ethnic cleansing operations. The photographs had been disturbing enough on their own, but what made them truly shocking was the presence of clearly identifiable American military personnel in leadership roles during mass killings. The images showed Americans who were not just present during atrocities, but were actively directing and participating in genocide. Dr. Martinez had used facial recognition software to analyze the photographs, comparing images of suspected war criminals with databases of known military personnel. The process had been complicated by the age of the photographs and the fact that many subjects were partially obscured by combat gear. But one face had produced a positive match that sent shockwaves through the investigation team. The man identified as commanding the massacre at the mass grave site was listed in American military databases as an active duty soldier who had subsequently been reported as missing in action during operations in Iraq. The soldier's name was Colonel Marcus Webb, a special operations officer who had been involved in classified missions throughout the 1990s and early 2000s. His military record indicated extensive experience in psychological warfare, unconventional operations, and foreign internal defense missions that were conducted in cooperation with Allied forces. Colonel Webb's service record had been mostly classified, but available information indicated he had been involved in sensitive operations in Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, and Iraq. His expertise in training foreign military forces and conducting covert operations had made him a valuable asset for missions that required plausible deniability. The revelation that Colonel Webb had been involved in war crimes in Bosnia had prompted a comprehensive review of all his known activities during the night. Investigation teams discovered evidence linking him to multiple atrocities that had been previously attributed to local forces acting independently. But the investigation had taken an unexpected turn when Dr. Martinez discovered that Colonel Webb had been reported missing in action in Iraq, and military records indicated he had been on a classified mission when he disappeared, and despite extensive search efforts, no trace of him had ever been found. The timing of Colonel Webb's disappearance had coincided exactly with the discovery of the unknown soldier who had become John Smith. Martinez had requested medical records and DNA samples from John Smith's case file, despite the apparent impossibility that a war criminal could have been living openly as a disabled veteran for 20 years. The DNA comparison had produced results that changed everything. John Smith was definitely Colonel Marcus Webb, the man responsible for ordering the execution of 200 civilians in Bosnia and potentially hundreds more victims in other conflicts throughout the night. The revelation that John Smith was actually a war criminal had shocked investigators who had been tracking Colonel Webb for over a decade. The man they had been hunting as one of the most wanted fugitives from international justice had been living openly in Iowa, receiving government benefits and being honored as a community hero. Dr. Martinez had been tasked with confronting John Smith with the evidence of his true identity. The confrontation would serve multiple purposes: confirming his identity through psychological response, gathering information about other war crimes, and beginning the process of bringing him to justice for his actions. The approach to John Smith's house in Cedar Falls had been carefully planned to avoid alerting him to the investigation or giving him opportunity to flee. Martinez had been accompanied by federal agents who were prepared to arrest John Smith if he attempted to escape or if he posed a threat to public safety. John Smith had answered his door with the same friendly demeanor that had made him beloved in the community. He had greeted Dr. Martinez politely and invited her inside, apparently assuming she was conducting routine veteran outreach or medical follow-up related to his disability status. Dr. Martinez had begun by explaining that she was investigating war crimes from the 1990s and was hoping John Smith might be able to provide information about military personnel who had served in Bosnia during that period. John Smith had responded with genuine interest and willingness to help, consistent with his established pattern of community service. But when Dr. Martinez had shown John Smith the photograph of Colonel Webb directing the massacre, his reaction had been immediate and unmistakable. The color had drained from his face, his hands had begun trembling, and he had stared at the image with an expression of growing horror and recognition. The psychological impact of seeing photographic evidence of his true identity had triggered the return of memories that had been suppressed for 20 years. John Smith had begun experiencing flashbacks to events he had completely forgotten, including detailed recollections of the massacre and other atrocities he had committed. The confrontation had continued for over 3 hours as John Smith's suppressed memories gradually returned. Martinez had documented his responses as he recalled specific details about war crimes that had never been publicly reported, confirming his identity and providing evidence that could be used in prosecution. John Smith's realization that he was actually Colonel Marcus Webb had been devastating. The man who had spent 20 years helping others and contributing to his community had discovered that his previous life had been dedicated to genocide and mass murder. The psychological trauma of this revelation had been almost unbearable. The investigation had revealed that Colonel Webb's amnesia had not been caused by enemy action. As his medical records suggested, analysis of his case file indicated that his memory loss had been the result of experimental psychological conditioning designed to allow war criminals to escape prosecution by assuming new identities. The program that had created John Smith's false identity had been a classified operation designed to protect valuable intelligence assets who had committed war crimes during covert operations. The amnesia had been artificially induced to allow Colonel Webb to begin a new life without the psychological burden of remembering his atrocities. But the psychological conditioning had been imperfect, and exposure to specific triggers had caused John Smith's suppressed memories to return with devastating clarity. The 20 years he had spent as a respected community member had been based on a lie that had finally been exposed. The arrest of John Smith had shocked the Cedar Falls community, where residents struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the war criminal he had been revealed to be. The veterans he had helped, the children he had coached, and the elderly residents he had assisted all found it impossible to believe that their beloved neighbor was capable of genocide. The legal proceedings that followed had been complicated by questions about John Smith's mental competency and whether someone with artificially induced amnesia could be held responsible for crimes they genuinely couldn't remember committing. Defense attorneys had argued that John Smith and Colonel Webb were essentially different people. But prosecutors had maintained that amnesia, regardless of its cause, did not absolve someone of responsibility for war crimes. The evidence of Colonel Webb's involvement in genocide was overwhelming, and the victims deserved justice regardless of the perpetrator's current mental state. The trial had become an international sensation, raising complex questions about identity, memory, and justice. John Smith's case had highlighted the inadequacy of existing legal frameworks for dealing with war criminals who had undergone psychological modification to escape prosecution. Testimony from Cedar Falls residents about John Smith's character had created a surreal contrast with evidence of Colonel Webb's atrocities. Witnesses described a man who had dedicated his life to helping others, while prosecutors presented photographs of mass graves and survivor testimony about systematic murder. The psychological evaluation of John Smith had revealed a man who was genuinely horrified by his recovered memories and who appeared to have developed a completely different personality during his 20 years of amnesia. The question of whether he should be punished for crimes committed by what was essentially a different version of himself had divided legal experts. The verdict had ultimately held John Smith legally responsible for Colonel Webb's war crimes, but the sentencing had taken into account the extraordinary circumstances of his case. The court had acknowledged that 20 years of genuine service to his community represented a form of rehabilitation that was unprecedented in war crimes prosecution. John Smith's conviction had brought closure to families of Colonel Webb's victims, but it had also destroyed the lives of people in Cedar Falls who had known him only as a helpful neighbor and community volunteer. The revelation that their trusted friend was a war criminal had shattered their faith in their ability to judge character. The case had also raised disturbing questions about how many other war criminals might be living under false identities created through classified programs designed to protect valuable intelligence assets. John Smith's exposure had prompted reviews of similar cases and investigations into the scope of identity modification programs. For John Smith himself, the return of his memories had been a psychological catastrophe that left him unable to reconcile his two identities. The man who had spent 20 years helping others was forced to confront the reality that he had previously spent years committing atrocities against innocent civilians. The photograph that had triggered John Smith's memory recovery had ultimately brought justice to victims of Colonel Webb's war crimes, but it had also destroyed the lives of everyone who had known and trusted the man he had become. The case demonstrated that some secrets are too terrible to remain hidden, even when exposure destroys the lives of innocent people who had been touched by a carefully constructed lie. John Smith's story had become a reminder that identity is more fragile than most people realize, and that the past has a way of catching up even with those who have genuinely forgotten their crimes. The war crimes investigator who knocked on his door had brought more than just a photograph. She had brought the truth that would destroy everything John Smith thought he knew about himself. The man everyone called John Smith had indeed been the perfect neighbor for 20 years. But the man in the photograph was Colonel Marcus Webb, and he had never been a hero. The past had finally caught up, and the truth was more terrible than anyone in Cedar Falls could have imagined.